So last week in my talk, I spoke about happiness, what is true happiness, and how do you go about finding this elusive thing called happiness from a Buddhist perspective. I'd like to devote the talk today on a completely different subject. I'd like to give you a brief introduction on Buddhism as a science of the mind. So we know that Buddhism is a religion and philosophy that was founded by the Buddhist Shakyamuni almost 2,600 years ago. But can Buddhism also be regarded as a science? So before I get into a discussion of this, I'd like to first share a quote with all of you by Albert Einstein. So Albert Einstein, he said, "The religion of the future will be a cosmic religion. It should transcend a personal God and avoid dogmas and theology. Covering both natural and spiritual, it should be based on a religious sense, arising from the experience of all things, natural and spiritual, and a meaningful unity." Buddhism answers this description. If there is any religion that could cope with modern scientific needs, it would be Buddhism. So is Buddhism really a science? In order to answer this question, we have to first understand that there are two types of sciences. There's the physical science and there's the mental science. In the physical science, it's concerned with the study of matter or physical objects. In the mental science, it's concerned with the study of the mind. The mind is a subjective experience, whereas matter is an objective one. So to examine matter, we have to focus our attention outwards. We have to use our senses to perceive matter. And in the physical sciences, they rely on instruments such as telescopes and microscopes to enhance their ability to perceive matter. On the other hand, in the mental science, we have to direct our attention inwards. It's an introspective process. As you know, the field of mental science that developed to study the mind is known as psychology. And in its early days, the branch of behavioral psychology that developed used extroverted means. They studied the outward behavior of humans and animals in order to understand the mind. The introspective process that was supported by many psychologists, one of which is Sigmund Freud, who is the founding father of modern psychotherapy. Their theories of introspection were rejected because it was seen as unscientific, because none of it could be tested externally by physical measurements like what you could in the physical sciences. So it was later discovered by the cognitive psychologists that looking at the human behavior of animals and humans, that was simply not enough. A full understanding of the mind could only be achieved by looking inwards towards our deepest inner experiences. It could still be very scientific though, because if you look at what science is simply a method. It's a method that can be summarized into 3 steps: observation, hypothesis, and verification. So you observe a particular phenomenon, you make a hypothesis about it, you make an inference and draw a conclusion about what you see, and that conclusion is not accepted until it's verified by experimental observation. So that's how it becomes a science. So Buddhism is really a science of the mind, because even though it can't be tested physically or externally, it can be verified through direct personal experience. So Buddhism is a science that uses the direct investigation and direct personal experience to understand and study the mind. So we know from reading the Dhammapada that the mind is the forerunner of all things. The Buddha told us that the mind experiences phenomena in the world, and everything is mind only, that nothing exists outside of the mind. Everything that we see, hear, smell, taste, and touch, those are all creations of the mind. Everything in this meditation hall, Buddha statues behind me, the wall paintings, the meditation stools that you're sitting on, even the people that are here today with us, people you see right in front of you, they're all creations of the mind. So, for those who haven't been introduced to this topic, I know it can sound a bit abstract and difficult to understand. It certainly was for me the first few times I heard it. But what the Buddha was trying to say was that all phenomena that you experience, whether it be in the nature, the trees, mountains, oceans, the earth, all possible objects that you can perceive through the sense of sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch, are all just mental projections that have been created by your mind. We think that objects exist as they really are. We think that what we see is an objective reality. But the Buddha told us that what we see is just a mental image that's distorted by the various different karma and mental states that we have. We know that two artists looking at the same scene can produce two very different paintings with large variations in color, texture, and shape. This distortion is even more apparent across sentient beings from the 6 realms of existence. So according to the Buddha, what we human beings see as just a regular pool of water, hungry ghosts, they see it as a pool of pus and blood. And heavenly devas, they see it as a land of shining crystal. So of course, within the human realm, there aren't such major distortions because we share very similar mental faculties. But the point is that what we perceive does not go beyond what the mind can experience. And everything exists in the mind only. In fact, there's not much meaning to talk about anything that exists outside of the mind, because if there isn't a mind to perceive that thing, then that thing doesn't exist. So, how is it that we perceive? The Buddha described this process in 5 steps, what we call the 5 aggregates, or the 5 skandhas. And we're usually accustomed to hearing the 5 skandhas in the particular order of form, feeling, conception, volition, and consciousness. But I'd like to present it in a slightly different order and with some minor variations in the translation of the terms to give you a better understanding of how everything we perceive is just in the mind and doesn't exist outside of the mind. This variation has been accepted and supported by many monks and Buddhist scholars, one of which is Bhante Punnaji. He is a very well-known Sri Lankan Theravadan monk, and he has made some great contributions to Buddhist psychology. So the 5 skandhas in this particular order are feeling, sensation, mental construction, perception, and mental image. So you'll notice that instead of putting form up in the very front, we've now put it at the very end. And we've translated it not as form, but as a mental image, a mental form. And I'll go about explaining why a bit later on, why this is the case. But let's first examine how the process of perception works. So everything first starts off with an object that stimulates the senses. So we can use the example of our sense of sight. So our eyes can only see in color. We don't see in full images. So when an object comes within our field of vision, what happens is our eyes, we detect the light that's reflected from the object. When this happens, there are two things that occur at the same time. The first is the feeling. In Pali, it's called the Vedana. And the second is the sensation, or the sanya. The feeling is the pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral sensation when you see something. And in this case, it refers to the different colors that you see. And the sensation refers to the contact, the light falling on your eyes. So when this happens, if I were to describe it in medical terms, the nerve endings in our retina detects the frequency or the wavelength of the colors that you see. And it sends those signals to the brain. When it reaches the brain, it begins to process all the different signals that have been received. And it puts all the colors together and begins to form a mental image. This activity of creating the mental image, that's called in Pali sankhara, which means construction. So it's a form of mental construction. So when you look at something, you're not just creating one construct, you're creating multiple different constructs. And each construct that you build, you give a name to it. And so you start noticing how one construct is related to another, and you put them together. So an example would be, you look at a face, and you see the nose, the eyes, the ears, and the mouth. And you relate all of these different features together relative to the face. And so you begin to interpret and give meaning to what you see based on what's in the present and what's available in your stored memory. So we call this vijnana, and it's translated as perception. And the resultant image that's created in your mind, that is called rupa, or mental image. Rupa can also be translated as form. But in this case, because we're saying that everything is a product of the mind, that there is no matter that exists outside of the mind, we put it at the very end and we translated it as a mental image. And this mental image, that is simply a process of perception. It is the product of what we perceive. So we can begin to see that everything in the world is just a creation of this process of perception that the Buddha referred to as the 5 aggregates. So now that we know this, how does this help with our practice? So if we know that everything we see are just clusters of images in the mind, and we know that we can't take things to be a true reality, then we can learn not to be so attached to our views and perceptions, because all they are creations of this conditioned mind. Instead, we should investigate and question what we see, knowing that our mind is filled with biases and perceptions that color our world and often can give us a false view of the true reality. So the mind is a process that happens unconsciously. You don't realize that it's happening unconsciously, but that's essentially what is happening in your mind. You don't need to be conscious of the process of perception in order for you to perceive. It happens all unconsciously. But it's through meditation and mindfulness that we can begin to be conscious of this unconscious process of the mind. So what that means is that instead of looking at what you see, you're looking at how you see. And you're much closer to the truth when you look at how you see over what you see. So the true nature of reality is something that can be discovered by unveiling the true nature of the mind, because it is the mind that creates everything. When the Buddha became enlightened, he became fully conscious and awakened to this unconscious process of the mind. And in doing so, he also became fully enlightened to the true nature of reality. So Buddhism has a lot to say about the mind. The Buddhist method is all about understanding the mind and freeing it from the delusions that lead us to suffering. What I've talked about today is only a very tiny, minuscule fraction of what the Buddha taught on the process of perception relating to the five senses. Apart from the five senses and the five consciousness, we know that there's also the sixth consciousness, what we call the mano. And in the Mahayana, we have the seventh and the eighth consciousness, known as the manas and the alaya or store consciousness. So the literature on all of this is very profound, and it's incredibly vast. You can easily spend your entire life studying the profound teachings in this particular school of Buddhism that we call Vijnanavada. But what I find very amazing about all of this is that what the Buddha taught about the mind almost 2,600 years ago, modern science is only beginning to discover. And everything that they're discovering only validates what the Buddha has said. So maybe Einstein was right. Maybe Buddhism is the one religion that's able to cope best with modern scientific needs. If that's the case, then the Buddha was not only a great teacher who found and taught others the way to enlightenment, but he was also the greatest scientist that ever lived. So thank you for listening.